Hello and welcome to the Amplifying Scientific Innovation video podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Sophia Ononye-Onyia, founder and CEO of the Sophia Consulting Firm, a life science marketing and communications consultancy that was established in New York City with the goal of amplifying scientific innovation. The goal of this podcast is to showcase scientific innovation stemming from global life science companies through conversations with senior leaders who share their unique leadership journey, corporate vision, and industry outlook. My guest today is Miss Kimberly Richardson, a 7-year survivor of stage 3A granulosa cell tumor, a rare type of ovarian cancer, who was recently diagnosed with triple positive breast cancer. Kim has 25 years of urban planning and community economic development experience. She managed Westside Business Improvement Association, WBIA, and served as an executive director until October 2013. Ms. Richardson has been active since treatment in various forms of advocacy and with several advocacy organizations. Excitingly, she has served in prominent advocacy roles with organizations such as the Ovarian Cancer Research Alliance, the National Coalition for Cancer Survivorship, and most recently, she is supporting the development of the Survivors Advising Scientists Educational Program, a collaborative program between researchers and patient advocates that creates educational content for survivors and patient advocates who want to learn more about cancer research and scientific inquiry. I was connected with Kim through the amazing John Novak, Director of Patient Engagement at Inspire, and I am inspired by her bravery, eloquence, and passion for amplifying the patient voice and need for clinical trial diversity. Welcome to the show, Kim.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me this morning.
It's my absolute pleasure. So I usually start the show with the same question. And for you, why would we change it, right? So what is your definition of scientific innovation?
As a person who has been a patient advocate for over 8 years, particularly with an ovarian cancer diagnosis, where we come into a realization that we are decades, in many instances, in discovering even a screening or a diagnostic test for ovarian cancer, right? As that type of patient advocate, going into this type of work, knowing that we are fighting not just for the cure, but for a screening test, then of course, scientific innovation means the world to us, right?
Right.
Any types of research that helps to move the needle and gets us closer to a diagnostic is going to change so many women's lives, not only for being able to detect ovarian cancer, but to deter so many of us from being late stage diagnosed.
Right.
So I think I do have a narrow view because I'm looking at this through the lens of survivorship and detection. I hate to say prevention of cancers, but detection of ovarian cancer. So I know I tend to look at it very narrowly, but to us, that's our world right now.
Absolutely.
Right? So when I look at innovation, that's the lens I'm going to look through. I'm going to always be looking for all us patient advocates who don't have diagnostic tests, that haven't gotten as far in advance in terms of research as our other cancer subtypes, like breast cancer, all the innovations, all the life-saving drugs, right? That's the crux of why we do our advocacy, to continue to say how important it is for funding for every single step of innovation, for every researcher who has made his or her life's calling ovarian cancer research. Imagine the hurdle, not only the politics, but the hurdle of someone who has chosen that particular cancer type. not where it's fun and sexy around breast cancer, and so much money is behind that. But cancers like ovarian cancer, where we haven't really, we're maybe a decade away from truly moving the needle.
Right, right. I mean, it's so interesting because I like how you focus your definition on your perspective, because you're not trying to be all things to all people, right? You are speaking from your perspective as a survivor of a very rare type of ovarian cancer. And to your point, oftentimes the innovation, the research, the investments tend to go to the more sexy types of cancers. And what you're saying is, through your voice as a patient advocate, as someone that's actually experienced this, is you want to amplify the importance of, hey, there are other cancers that exist and we should be paying attention to that. So thank you for that great definition.
Mm-hmm. So you need to figure a way, a sort of way to unravel that, right? And it starts so close to academic institutions where these students are making these decisions about what path they're going to choose. It starts so close to them. And I think that's how you're going to find how I've connected my work back to survivors advising scientists.
Yeah, I really can't wait to talk about that. But, I imagine you've been asked this question in many forms before, but I would like to know, not just personally, but philosophically as well, how did suffering from stage 3A granulosa cell tumor of the ovaries change you personally and professionally?
Gosh, well, to be honest, there are these infographics that show you what your symptoms are.
Yeah.
And I didn't have any of them. Not one. And so the way mine was even discovered was basically from me. I was training for a marathon here in Chicago and realized I was a different type of tired. It wasn't the runner's naps that I needed. It was, I would lay down and be, knocked out for 6-7 hours. And I went back to my primary and we just went through a battery of tests. And when we got to the pap smear, it was when they discovered that my cells were abnormal. But I was like, well, that's been my entire life. But because of my age, they said, let's take this further. And it's due only to my primary. Of course, for me coming in, talking about my symptoms of fatigue, but how the modality she took to get me to that diagnosis. I then did an ultrasound, which said, oh, it's just a cyst. So I was literally diagnosed on the table during surgery.
Wow.
That's not necessarily uncommon with ovarian cancer. Again, these linkages that I talk about in terms of diagnostics and screenings. Whatever is on the screen, people just don't know what it is until they know what it is. And so personally, having gone from a very active person, running, enjoying my life, dealing with my kids, my twins, a boy and a girl at the time, they were about 9, going on 10, running my non-for-profit, to everything shutting down. Now I'm in a surgery. Now I'm doing chemo. Now I'm interacting with an oncologist that doesn't want to listen or answer questions. So imagine if you were this sort of type A professional coming to a diagnosis where you're now searching the internet for answers and they're not there.
Right.
And the only person that you could interact with is the oncologist, and she's type A too. So it was the constant butting of heads. So if you can imagine a person who doesn't have a lot of information,
right,
thinking that everything that's on the internet says in 5 years, you're going to be dead.
Wow.
Not understanding that wasn't even my type of ovarian cancer. But because granulosal cell tumor, GCT wasn't as researched because it's a rare form of ovarian cancer. Mm-hmm. So think about all these layers that I had to deal with at the time. Black female, rare cancer, and then a rare subtype.
Wow.
Trying to connect to another female and say, what is going on? What is happening in my life? Am I dying? Well, how should I be preparing? Mm-hmm. Why am I doing this treatment and not being able to get just the simple types of answers? So personally, yes, it took me, it was very traumatic. And I was in therapy for about a year, just trying to deal with the uncertainty of ovarian cancer, right? And also dealing every 3 weeks with this oncologist for 6 months.
Wow.
Yeah. So personally, professionally, things slowed down tremendously for me, right? It wasn't as important. I had to figure out what I could grapple with and what I could control, right? Cancer was not something that I could control, but I couldn't stop being a mother.
I know. You can't take a day off.
Right?
That. No.
Kids still needed to go to school. Mm-hmm. Homework needed to be monitored. Mm-hmm. They were still in activities, and I made those things happen. So yes, personally and professionally, I kept the train moving, but it was a raggedy train. That's the best way I can put it. It wasn't the most perfect time in my life, but what it did show me was that it's so important for the patient's experience to be heard.
Yes. Yes.
Some people have these wonderful stories about how, my oncologist saved my life. And to that end, I can say, oh, absolutely. Mm-hmm. She saved my life. I'm still here. Mm-hmm. 8 years later, impeccable surgeon, not the best communicator. Mm-hmm. And so as time went on, of course, I learned a lot more about GCT. I was driven to learn more about, who is doing our advocacy work, who's out there trying to get our message out, right? And through that whole entire process, learning so much about the politics of advocacy as well, right? Who is best at being the representative of ovarian cancer, right? And of course, I'm not going to, candy coat that, but to the extent that I decided that I matter.
Right.
As a Black female, as a Black female with ovarian cancer, my story matters too.
Absolutely. Not just today, forever. Your story matters. Your voice matters. Absolutely.
And so where space could not be made for me, I made space for myself.
There you go. That's the spirit right there. And as I told you, I'm just inspired by your bravery, the ability to smile. And there's such power and grace in your smile, but it takes going through a very life-changing experience to actually wake up and say, what are we doing to challenge the narrative? And I'm not just going to sit back and say, my oncologist is not communicating with me. I am going to find ways to advocate so that people will learn to actually ask patients what they think. What do you think? So I love the continuity in the story, because my next question is about, how did you tap into that 25 years of urban planning experience that you have? How has that experience helped to shape your role as a prominent patient advocate for influential organizations such as the Ovarian Research Alliance, and of course, the National Coalition for Cancer Survivorship? So tell us more about how you were able to sort of build that continuity.
It was literally over a 2-year process of me starting out, trying to find all the advocacy organizations and saying, yeah, I want to be involved. And I started out with one organization and they were largely more of awareness advocacy, where they did a lot of fundraisers and health fairs and things like that. And I was like, okay, you know, I got a lot of runner friends. I'm sure I can, you know, do great fundraisers for you. But what ended up happening was when I mentioned that I was interested in making sure African-American women knew more about ovarian cancer and its symptoms and its risk factors, I was literally and honestly told, well, the data just doesn't bear that out. We just don't have enough African-American women being diagnosed with ovarian cancer for us to push that narrative. And I'm like, well, I'm more than a data point. I have ovarian cancer. What are we saying? When you say to me that I have, the only value I have is to be in your 5K and to help fundraise for your operational costs, it challenges my thinking about where my energy should be, you know? So of course I moved on, and I, you know, you continue to learn about advocacy in different ways. Like that was awareness advocacy. And so of course, when I got involved with the Ovarian Cancer Research Alliance, I came to that experience a little bit more guarded, right? I knew then that I was going to be involved with talking about increases for funding in Capitol Hill with lawmakers. I had taken my experience as a non-for-profit in Chicago because I have interacted with those lawmakers. They're the same lawmakers that were elected and present when I had my non-for-profit. So I was very familiar with them, very familiar with their staff. And so going to Capitol Hill as opposed to going to their downtown or neighborhood office, I was just changing venues.
Wow.
Right?
Wow.
So, and of course, changing topics that I was talking to them about. Before, it used to be more about economic development and, you know, empowering neighborhood businesses. And now I'm talking to them and I'm saying, hey, it's Kimberly. Nice to see you again, but I've had cancer. And now it's a whole nother dynamic of talking to them and representing another organization and not representing myself or my own personal organization. So yeah, it's looking at advocacy, my road to that, those two groups, starting out with OCRA, Ovarian Cancer Research Alliance, you start to learn that, again, these are wonderful organizations, but as an advocate, you're either making the choice to advocate for their agenda, which serves you because you're an ovarian cancer patient. So there's some give and take. But when little things like just interacting with the women that are a part of ovarian cancer advocacy, you realize that it's a representation of the entire nation. And so once again, not candy coating anything, right? It's a representation of the entire nation. So there are some people who have never in their day-to-day experience had to interact with an African American. And so when you come to a conference or you go to the Hill, those are the experiences that people bring to the table, even as simple as lunchtime. Who will sit with who? So I love that organization. I love the staff, but it's a microcosm of the entire nation. And you have to have a very thick skin in advocacy, right? As an African American, you have to have a thicker skin because, like I said before, there are so many people who have not interacted with African Americans on a daily basis. And so when they are brought together for a couple of days, that lack of interaction shows.
Really? And how do you see the manifestation of the lack of interaction? Is it a hesitancy to speak to you? What was it?
Oh yeah, it's all social. Yeah, it's all social. It's, it's who you're comfortable with, expectations that you may have of African Americans in that setting. I was told on too many occasions how articulate I am and how bright I am.
See,
you've heard that one. So
oh,
yeah.
Oh, your English is so good.
Yeah. And so those are the challenges. As you see yourself, you have a pretty good understanding of who you are as a human being. And then you come into this group, the common thread that pulls you together can often be the very thing that pulls you apart.
Right.
And so challenge once again to say, where am I going to fit? Where is my messaging going to come from? Right? If there's always going to be some tensions, and we all have experienced that this year with COVID, right? The whole ripping off of the covers of disparities. And how we truly have an honest conversation about that. Right? And it has taken center stage in front of cancer advocacy. How have these organizations dealt with disparities? How are you sweeping up around your own back porch? And that was the challenge for a lot of advocacy organizations. Again, as you deal with people as a human being, as I said, I love the staff. I love what the organization stands for. But when we bring that representation from across America as advocates, that's when you really see the disparities. That's when you really see what we're challenged with. A good example for me is many of these advocates then become Facebook friends. You get to see how they really think on their individual Facebook pages when we're not talking about ovarian cancer. That's the challenge, right? How do you continue to work and go to Capitol Hill and persuade lawmakers about ovarian cancer when you can read someone else's Facebook page that says Black people are looting in the streets because of George Floyd? And see Black people as looters and not protesters, and see that whole dialogue, right? So how do you continue to say, I can work with you as an advocate on this issue of ovarian cancer research and have total disrespect for me as an African American? So those are the challenges, right?
Yeah. And, it's interesting because you go into these organizations maybe a little naively. You want to believe that the commonality of being cancer survivors, cancer patients, etc., would allow you all to form a genuine bond, right? That will actually manifest in a renewal on how people see the world, race relations, social dynamics. It's like your world should be transformed so that you become less judgmental and sort of perhaps more eager to understand rather than to be understood. So I'm really glad in some ways that you've had this experience with these organizations. And because I know how vocal you are not the type of person that is going to sweep things under the carpet. And they are so lucky to have you.
Well, you're so right. I mean, I remember sitting in my hotel room the very first time I went to a conference and sending a text message to my friend and saying, ovarian cancer is not about the color teal. That's our color is teal. Breast cancer is pink, we're teal. And I said, this is not what this is about. This is not about teal. What I've experienced in this last 3 days it's not about Teal.
Yeah.
You know, but as you said, I'm old enough and wise enough now to extend grace.
Right.
And so to continue to talk to staff and to say, these are some issues that are pressing. They're glaringly apparent,
mm-hmm.
and we have to start to fix it. And so I'm pleased to see now that OCRA has created a disparities task force, and I'm on that task force.
Yay! That's the spirit.
So that's what, that's what keeps me staying at the table to address what I see as, wrong, if it's for a better word, but then to say, now, how are we going to fix this?
Mm-hmm.
How are we going to acknowledge what's not necessarily right about this? Can we come to some consensus
mm-hmm.
that this isn't cool?
Mm-hmm.
And then how can we extend grace to one another to give each other that space to start to fix this?
Mm-hmm.
And that's what I feel keeps me motivated to continue to work with advocacy organizations.
Great. And
willingness to do it.
And I love that about you, because it ties into my next question, because I do believe, as you alluded to, that patients can play a very important role in scientific innovation. So I would like you to just share more on that. Can we dive into that? What role can patients play in scientific innovation? And how are you leveraging your insights on the importance of bidirectional learning to pioneer the Survivors Advising Scientists Educational Program? Is it SASEP, right?
Yes.
Would love to hear more.
What I initially learned through my journey, because I had postgraduate academic experience with research, mm-hmm. It wasn't foreign to me mm-hmm. to look at a poster, to look at a scientific poster, to understand what a bar graph looks like. Mm-hmm. What type of information is it trying to convey, right? But what I did learn through advocacy is that there are all types of people, and we all fit along this continuum. Right. Some people share their story and go to Capitol Hill and move and influence lawmakers with their story, right? Mm-hmm. For me, that wasn't as important to me as when we were all together at one of the lawmakers' offices. As everyone was sharing their story, the staffer said, "So where are we on immunotherapy?"
Okay.
And no one in that room could speak to it. They could share their story, but we were there to ask for additional money for ovarian cancer research. And we can't speak to the different modalities regarding research. That was a light bulb moment for me, that we're like, this is where our gap is. This is probably one of the major reasons why ovarian cancer is not being highly funded, right? If its advocates can't speak to the actual research,
yeah,
and the importance of it, other than sharing their story, I think that supplements the story.
Yeah.
To be able to say, and this is where we are on immunotherapy, and this is where granulosal cell tumor research is at the current state. These are the leading researchers. This is why they need additional money, right?
Yeah.
We're not connecting that dot as well. I think it's really important that that's where we fundamentally start. For those who like to share their story, we should have as many advocates in that room who can talk to research. That is the building block of the breast cancer mm-hmm. community. Mm-hmm. They are being trained to go to Capitol Hill and to speak quite eloquently to the research around breast cancer, and then share their experience, right? Mm-hmm. So there are women out there who have advocated for triple positive breast cancer. And now we have Herceptin.
Mm-hmm.
And Herceptin is something that I am now going to be treated with 5 years, 10 years later. And it's because of those advocates who unfortunately were dying from triple positive breast cancer. We didn't have a treatment plan for HER2 positive. And that's the most aggressive part of our breast cancer. But because those advocates could share their story and say, this is where we need the money, we now have Herceptin.
Right.
And so we can't miss that very simple connection. Who's telling the story and who's going to tell it best? It's going to be the patient advocate. So this is where I feel our training needs to shift. And all patient advocates who are not necessarily getting the light shined or shown on their particular disease, it's important that you've done the research about the disease. It's important. How are we going to communicate the need for additional research, the need for additional money, if we can't identify when we're talking to the lawmakers about where that money needs to go?
Right. Right.
Right. And that's what SASEP is all about. It's survivors advising scientists. The model basically is, how do patient advocates interact with researchers? We're not necessarily talking about our relationship with our oncologists. That's a different relationship. That's about getting us through treatment and getting us to recovery. What I'm talking about is, how do we start to talk a shared language? So you explain to me what the research is. I then can ask you some questions. And then, of course, I have a broader audience in which to speak to, right? You and I as a scientist, you're not going to come to Capitol Hill with me, but it's going to be 250 women in teal t-shirts on Capitol Hill that can share a story, and we can bring your research with us, and we can eloquently speak to that research if we've had relationship with you, right?
Wow.
And so how do we do that? How do we change the narrative about how patients and researchers work together? If we do this with cancer trainees, younger researchers, right? These will become our senior researchers one day. These are the people who will be able to communicate research in simpler terms because of their relationships with patients. It won't be so much about the scientific jargon.
No.
Right? It will be an easier way for them to communicate, not only with patients, but with journalists, right? With the people who can get their message out. But yet we have these institutions and systems in which we bring a scientist through, right? They learn a certain jargon, and they never stop using that jargon all the way through. They never see the connection of working back with patients. It's about their research. It's about publication. It's about the next grant. But when it comes to who's getting the most money in research, how well have you talked to anyone about the importance of your research? And they don't understand it.
Yeah.
So we're trying to find these simpler ways through these training modules to work with cancer trainees where they talk about research, basic scientific inquiry what is an independent and dependent variable? Why do you need to know that as a patient advocate? Because when you look at that scientific poster, that's the beginning of that person's research. Do you understand confounding factors? Do you understand the statistical significance of this person's research, right? Do you understand what type of study this was? Was it a retroactive study? So when we come to conference on scholarship, we're kind of just sort of sitting in the expo center, looking at your scientific poster and having no clue what it says.
Yes.
But then advocacy organizations want us to go to Capitol Hill and share our story. We're much more powerful than that.
Right.
And the added information and education of what research is actively being done right now strengthens and amplifies that story. When I can go to Capitol Hill and I can talk about my GCT story, and then I can also say, 8 years down the road, we're possibly going to have a vaccine for ovarian cancer. This is what the researchers are working on. This is where we are right now. No modality, no diagnostic, no screening test. But here's where the researchers are right now. And if you give them just that extra money, that extra push, do you realize how many more lives we could save? Do you realize how many more women we could keep from being late stage diagnosed? It's much more powerful in our 15 minutes with that lawmaker.
Yeah. I mean, I couldn't
hear that story.
I couldn't agree with you more. I think this whole notion of the data-enabled patient is one that I'm very excited about. And as you know from previous conversations, I used to be a triple-negative breast cancer researcher at Yale. And I can honestly tell you that there was never a time where I actually sat down with a TNBC patient to just go to teach them what I'm doing and to hear from them about their insights. So that's why I was really keen to learn about this bidirectional learning. And I'm encouraged by patients like you. I think, to your point, it's not the same, oh, tell us about your story, but if you can actually talk about immunotherapies, if you can talk about some of the data that you've seen and how excited or not excited you are about the data, I think that would allow you to be more credible, right? And not just, another patient telling the same story from an emotional, psychosocial perspective. So,
right. And how effective can we be when we're 8 years out from our diagnosis? Still sharing that same story.
Wow.
Right?
Wow.
How effective is that? How effective is it when you are 25 years out?
Wow.
Bravo. 25 years from being no evidence of disease. But how effective is that cancer story in that 15 minutes? Who's more important in the room at that point, right? That's the challenge of how do we grow as patient advocates. This whole idea of bidirectional learning comes through our program because we ask the students, we ask the cancer trainees to develop the content. And before it's professionally done, it's sent out nationwide to patient advocates. We ask them to review it, review the content, review what you're seeing, review the trainee in terms of communication style. All that feedback comes back to that trainee, right? And they have to revise their drafts. But the coolest part of it all is that the trainee then sends back information to the patient advocate and says, okay, you had 6 things you wanted me to change. Here's why I can tell you I can't change these 3. These are just things that are part of scientific inquiry. I can't change the way I communicate that to you, right? I can change the color of it. I can change the font size, but here are these are principles within scientific research. And so the conversation goes back and forth and says, well, can you say it a different way? And it's like, yeah, I can do that, right? And so what happens in this bidirectional process? The patient advocate learns more about scientific inquiry because they're a part of the review process. The trainee learns another added skill set. They have their research skills down. They're presenting at conferences. But what they lack is the ability to convey that in layman's terms.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So when a journalist comes to that conference and says, wow, your research looks really interesting,
mm-hmm.
and you start rattling off that scientific jargon, how well did that journalist portray your research in print?
Mm-hmm.
He got what you gave him.
Exactly.
But when when trainees are now allowed to learn how to decipher their own research
mm-hmm.
in easy to understand language, imagine how fast that research can spread.
I know.
And who'd be willing to do it for you?
That's
Thank
remarkable.
you. That makes sense to me.
Yeah. That is remarkable. And I love this idea of bidirectional learning and that it's actually being put into practice. And it also ties into my second to last question for you. One of the topics that is very important to the both of us is the need for increased focus on clinical trial diversity. So what are, a couple of important factors, one or two factors that you think will be important for sustaining clinical trial diversity in the next 5 to 10 years?
Oh my goodness. The thing for me is the realization that we've got patient engagement all wrong. I think that when we started having these conversations around diversity, when the covers got pulled off, because if we're all honest, we were quite fine with the clinical trials from a leadership perspective,
mm-hmm.
from them being homogeneous.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody cared.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody was making this a mandate until it became a thing.
Mm-hmm.
And so now that it's a thing, what we're going to grapple with is who's sitting in those positions and their level of comfortability in working with people of color. I'm challenged with that right now with a different program that I'm actually helping out on. It's like they're all, the investors are all white, and they're trying to figure out, well, how do we engage the community? So they have all these other narratives about, well, let's go through the Black church to find more people. And it's like, we have the same methodology for social justice, and we think that we can apply that.
I know.
To diversity in clinical trials. So the way the Black church organized us around social justice back in the 50s and 60s is the same one that unfortunately white people think will be the way they can organize us around participation in clinical trials. It's not going to work. Let's go through the Black church. Let's have health fairs and let's speak at the Black church and say how important it is to be involved. No, as a planner, that's my background as an urban planner. I see what's at ground zero, what is actually within the urban space, what is being funded both by city and state and federal governments as interventions within urban centers and rural centers that are completely being overlooked as places, not only for clinical trials, but methodologies to reach neighborhood residents. All of these systems are in place and have been in place, but unfortunately have not worked at an efficient level. So all of these community clinics, safety net hospitals, all in place in urban centers that have been neglected with funding, with qualified staff, right? Here in Chicago, within my own neighborhood, we have about 4 safety net hospitals, one by one closing down. Wouldn't it be interesting if the true investment in diversity in clinical trials by leadership within pharma was to work with city and state officials on economic development incentives to renovate these hospitals and use them as clinical trial sites? For the city and states to give them economic development incentives to drive down the costs of these renovations, right? Tax increment financing districts. Most of our safety net hospitals are inside of these TIF districts where they could receive funding for that renovation and supplement something directly that's happening in a neighborhood from a health issue. So if you use, for example, the community clinic that an average resident walks to, that's a trust bearer in the community. That doctor is someone that a resident goes to, not necessarily on a regular basis, but someone, okay, I got a cold, or, you know, I need something checked out. Well, I may not have an actual primary, a PCP at a local teaching hospital, but I do go down the street to that doctor at that community clinic. What's to say that pharma couldn't train that doctor to become a clinical investigator? Create curriculum that trains that doctor. That is now a clinical trial site. Just looking at that from 2 different vantage points, the win-win. This clinic gets an infusion of funding. That particular, that set of doctors gets a new skill set, right? We've tapped into more African-American and people of color on the ground. They are the true trust bearers that can talk to those residents about clinical trial participation.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Those safety net hospitals, even bigger, of course, even a bigger enterprise to renovate. But again, retraining doctors in those sites with the infrastructures already there within the hospital for testing, for blood tests, for, you know, actually conducting the research. I don't think we're ready to think outside of the box. We're still on this, Muhammad comes to the mountain.
Right.
And saying, this is how we're going to deal with diversity. You are not going to get people of color to come to you. You have to come to them.
Right.
And you have to look at the existing infrastructure within urban centers and find out, what can we renovate? Where can we incubate clinical trials, clinical trial sites? It's thinking outside the box.
I know.
But it's the willingness to do so. Because at the end of the day, the only way you're going to get the clinical trial investigator to say, yes, I will come to that neighborhood where I'm not necessarily comfortable.
Right.
And do this clinical trial.
Right.
We know that long-term, that's not going to work.
Right.
So why not work with the people who have already invested in those communities and where the residents see them as trust bearers?
Yeah.
Retrain them. If the goal is truly to get our numbers increased around people of color participating in trials, create a win-win situation for both pharma, for the concept of research, and as well as those folks who are lingering in our communities. They're maybe a year or 2 from shutting down.
I know.
simply because they just don't have any funding.
I know.
It's a way to think about it.
I mean, I think it's a remarkable way to think about it. And I hope that our audience, especially those that are in the life science, pharma, biotech space, are listening to what you're saying, because we cannot keep using the same old ways. Oh, let's go find them in church. Not everybody goes to church. Let's not forget that. And amid COVID, we've obviously seen a decline in sort of church gatherings, right? So a lot of things are moving to the digital space, right? So it's about how do you leverage those digital technology tools, whether it's an Apple iWatch or whatever the case might be. And as clinical trials become more decentralized, how do you tap into sort of the local resources, the grassroots programs, as you said, right? So it's not, and it's going to require a partnership, to your point, with the local communities. It's not just sort of this one size fits all approach. If we're really going into this era of personalized medicine, then our approach needs to be personalized as well. So that is extremely well said.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. And you shared a lot. And I appreciate how candid you've been, but I want to make sure that I give you the floor for any additional commentary or thoughts that you might have before we wrap up today's conversation.
Well, I'm going to always push. I'm going to always be looking for researchers who are challenging themselves. If you're senior researchers and you have those leadership capacities, how well is your education and training curriculum incorporating patient advocacy? At any step, in terms of when you are about to start teaching these trainees about basic research, when we start with the very basics of scientific inquiry, how well are patient advocates involved in that process? Because in order for us to truly have this partnership where patient advocates and their voices are heard, it really does start at the very beginning of both medical school as well as our research and academic institutions. If we don't show them that the end result is the patient in the beginning, then we're not seen as partners. We're seen as, I don't know, I guess the product of what you do for a living. But it's like, at the end of the day, you're doing this for me.
Right.
And so I'm the patient.
Right.
So it's like, to me, it's a no-brainer. It's like, it's common sense that we start to infuse this level of communication between the two entities. Patient advocates have a very strong voice. We are living experts.
Yes, yes. And it's a powerful voice. It's a well-informed voice. And to the points that you made earlier, we need to educate that voice so that it can even be more amplified, right? And it becomes about educating people as well. That whole concept of bidirectional learning, which I absolutely love. So thank you. I think I could talk to you all day. I mean, just selfishly, of course, but I would have to let you go this time. But you best believe, Miss Kimberly Richardson, that we'll be having another conversation very soon. So thank you so much for your time.
I welcome that. I welcome the opportunity to talk with you again.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Same here. Have a good day, okay?
Thank you.